Prime Minister Mark Carney is wrapping up his time at the G20 summit here in Johannesburg. It was an exceptional summit because of the U.S. boycott.
The global auto system is now facing the most dangerous fracture in its modern history. And it started not in Detroit or Washington, but in Canada. When world leaders were still processing the shock of President Donald Trump skipping the Group of 20 summit, an even larger disruption was quietly forming across North America. Canada, long considered the United States' most stable industrial partner, made a decision that stunned economists, automakers, and policymakers worldwide. It withdrew from core bilateral auto cooperation frameworks and triggered the largest consumer boycott of American-made vehicles ever recorded. For more than 3 decades, the North American production network operated like one unified machine. Every 24 hours, roughly $2 billion United States dollars worth of goods crossed the border, most of it auto parts cycling through factories in Ontario, Michigan, Quebec, and Illinois. That system relied on trust, seamless coordination, and predictable trade rules. But the new wave of tariffs from Washington shattered that foundation and pushed Canada into a historic economic realignment. Now, a fundamental question is emerging. Is this the beginning of a new North American trade war that could reshape the future of the United States auto industry? Stay with this report, because by the end of this episode, we will reveal the turning point that is now putting the United States at risk in a way not seen in decades. To understand the scale of this rupture, we must begin with the reality that North America's auto industry is not merely an economic sector, it is the spine of continental manufacturing. For more than 3 decades, the United States and Canada built a production ecosystem so tightly interwoven that economists often described it as a shared industrial organism. A vehicle sold in Texas could contain steel from Quebec, wiring harnesses from Ontario, and software modules designed in British Columbia. Each 24-hour cycle moved more than $2 billion United States dollars in goods across the border, and more than 350,000 American jobs depended directly on Canadian components. That level of integration meant any instability, any delay, any tariff, any border dispute would send shockwaves through the entire system. But early in the year 2025, instability did not merely appear, it exploded. President Donald Trump's revived America First trade agenda imposed 25 tariff levels on Canadian auto imports and repeatedly threatened to raise them to 35 unless Ottawa complied. The public message targeted China, but the immediate casualties were Canadian factories, Canadian workers, and a bilateral supply chain that had been described by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development as one of the most efficient production corridors in the world. The corporate reaction was swift and brutal. Stellantis shifted a major production line from Ontario to Illinois, wiping out more than 4,000 Canadian jobs in a single corporate decision. General Motors reduced operations in Ingersoll, citing weak electric vehicle demand, rising input costs, and unpredictable United States trade policy. Ottawa attempted to slow the damage by granting temporary exemptions from its retaliatory 25 tariff structure, but public trust and corporate confidence were already deteriorating. Behind closed doors, Canadian officials warned that the United States was no longer a predictable partner, but an economic risk factor. And when the United States refused to offer clarity or pause escalation, Canada concluded that the system itself was no longer salvageable. What happened next did not just reshape policy, it shattered a 30-year economic equilibrium. The next development will reveal how Canadian retaliation evolved into the largest consumer backlash against American vehicles in modern history. When Ottawa formally withdrew from its long-standing auto cooperation framework with the United States, the decision sent diplomatic ripples across world capitals. But inside Canada, something far more powerful was awakening: a nationwide consumer revolt. It did not begin with protests, petitions, or political rhetoric. It began with purchasing decisions silent, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. Within weeks, retailers across Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia reported a sudden collapse in demand for American-assembled vehicles. Internal dealer networks confirmed what the government suspected but did not publicly say: a historic shift was underway. Models produced in Michigan, Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois, once dominant in Canadian driveways, plunged from more than 45% market share to below 30% in less than 1 calendar year. This was the steepest contraction of demand for American vehicles in Canada since modern tracking data began. Meanwhile, sales of Japanese, Korean, and European vehicles surged by as much as 20 to 25%, according to data collected by the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association. Consumers were not searching for lower prices. They were expressing political rejection. For many Canadians, choosing a non-American vehicle became a quiet but direct response to Washington's tariff escalation. The message was simple. If the United States could weaponize trade, then Canadian households could weaponize their wallets. This shift was so pronounced that several dealerships in Toronto and Vancouver reported wait lists for Korean and Japanese models stretching beyond 6 months. Used car prices for American brands depreciated more quickly than expected, driven by plunging demand. Insurance companies began adjusting long-term valuation models due to the sudden imbalance. By mid-year 2025, economists from the University of Calgary described the trend as a coordinated consumer realignment unprecedented in North American automotive history. And yet, this was only the visible effect. The deeper rupture was happening across the border. American automakers were not prepared for what followed. The United States manufacturing system, built on the expectation of smooth Canadian inputs, immediately felt the strain of declining export volumes and rising costs. The Bureau of Economic Analysis recorded a 0.4% decline in automotive industrial output in its October report, and analysts attributed the majority of that drop to disruptions in Canadian imports. A missing wiring module from Ontario could stall the assembly of an entire sport utility vehicle line in Michigan. A delayed shipment of aluminum from Quebec could erase the already thin margins on electric trucks. A cost increase in battery minerals nickel, potash, lithium filtered directly into manufacturing budgets. Every delay amplified the next. Every extra tariff pushed production costs higher. Bloomberg reported that operating expenses for multiple American auto manufacturers rose between 12 and 18 due to cross-border friction. Industry groups warned that each additional 10 tariff imposed on Canadian metals added nearly 300 to 480 United States dollars in production cost per vehicle. That cost ultimately flowed to American consumers, pushing retail prices higher during a period of already fragile demand. The United States Chamber of Commerce issued a rare public rebuke, stating that the tariff policy was causing structural harm to the United States supply chain. Midwestern manufacturers warned of rising material costs and worsening delivery times. Even the United Auto Workers Union publicly expressed frustration, arguing that policy unpredictability was threatening long-term American employment far more than foreign competition. As these pressures intensified, American automakers found themselves trapped. If they raised prices, demand would collapse. If they absorbed the cost increases, profits would evaporate. If they shifted production away from Canada, the transition would take years and billions in new investment. Every option carried consequences. And yet, the most alarming development had not even surfaced in public reports. The next phase of this crisis would expose a hidden vulnerability inside the United States auto sector that few policymakers were prepared to confront. As the trade confrontation intensified, Canada found itself in a paradoxical position. Damaged in the short term, but newly empowered in its long-term strategic trajectory. At the peak of the disruptions, more than 4,000 Canadian auto workers had lost their positions following Stellantis' relocation. General Motors' scale back in Ingersoll added further instability. Consumer confidence at the start of the year had weakened, and supply chain volatility temporarily raised operating costs. Yet, instead of collapsing under pressure, Canada transformed the crisis into the most ambitious industrial reconstruction in its modern economic history. Ottawa redirected public procurement contracts toward domestic steel, domestic aluminum, and domestically assembled equipment. Billions in federal spending, previously allocated to foreign vendors, were rerouted to Canadian manufacturers. The 2025 federal budget injected 9 billion Canadian dollars into defense industrial expansion, energy infrastructure, nuclear development, and critical mineral processing. These investments did not merely replace the lost auto sector jobs, they fundamentally reshaped the Canadian industrial model. By autumn 2025, Statistics Canada reported 60,000 new jobs created in September alone, with wage growth rising by 3.3 year over year. The unemployment rate, while still standing at 7.1, had shifted into a downward trend due to high-volume hiring in construction, energy, and transportation infrastructure. Canadian mining companies accelerated production of nickel, lithium, and potash, positioning Canada as a central supplier to Asian electric vehicle battery manufacturers. South Korean and Japanese firms expanded investment partnerships, citing Canada's political stability and reliable commodities. Meanwhile, national sentiment hardened dramatically. Cross-border travel dropped, cross-border shopping slowed, and consumers increasingly favored locally produced goods. According to data from Statistics Canada, cross-border vehicular returns from the United States decreased by 34, reflecting a broader distrust of the American marketplace. Canadian grocery chains, electronics retailers, and alcohol distributors all reported declining sales of American goods. This shift was not temporary behavior driven by anger. It was the beginning of a structural consumer transformation, one that economists now warn could permanently reduce the United States' share of the Canadian market. However, the economic shock that emerged south of the border would prove even more unsettling. While Canada was stabilizing and repositioning its economic architecture, the United States began facing a harsher reality. The tariff escalation was undercutting the very workers and industries it claimed to protect. American automakers, already strained by declining electric vehicle demand and rising material costs, now confronted a new challenge: the partial breakdown of their single most efficient foreign supply chain. The October report from the Federal Reserve indicated a 0.4 decline in automotive industrial output, seemingly small yet devastating when applied to an industry operating on thin margins and high debt exposure. Midwestern factories reported shortages in Canadian steel, delayed shipments of Quebec aluminum, and repeated interruptions in the flow of wiring harnesses, sensors, and microcontroller units from Ontario. Each missing component halted production lines worth millions of United States dollars per day. American consumers began feeling the pressure as retail vehicle prices increased by 1.5 to 3.2, according to Cox Automotive. Families considering a new vehicle faced a choice between higher monthly payments or postponing purchase entirely. American dealerships in the Midwest reported rising inventory levels for United States-built models, while foreign-built alternatives gained traction due to better price stability. Even more concerning, manufacturers began quietly examining contingency plans, relocating select operations to Mexico, accelerating automation at the expense of manual labor, or negotiating long-term supply contracts with Asian firms instead of Canadian partners. These strategies could erode American employment levels for decades. The United States Chamber of Commerce issued one of its strongest warnings in recent years, stating that the tariff confrontation was causing structural damage to the United States manufacturing base. Analysts fear that if the standoff persists, America's position as the central hub of North American automotive production could begin slipping first quietly, then rapidly. But the most alarming revelation was not the job losses, not the rising prices, and not even the fracturing supply chain. It was a hidden strategic weakness inside the United States auto sector that no administration had adequately prepared for, and that weakness is about to come into full view in the next phase of this crisis. From the standpoint of Washington, the tariff escalation was introduced under the banner of economic protection. The stated intention was straightforward: defend American manufacturing, reduce foreign dependence, and revive industrial strength within national borders. On paper, this strategy appeared logical. But the unfolding data tells a very different and far more troubling story. American automakers rely heavily on Canadian metals, Canadian electronics, Canadian mineral inputs, and Canadian engineering. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that nearly half of the value inside a typical United States manufactured vehicle originates outside the country, with Canada representing a significant share. Disrupting this supply chain was not equivalent to reducing reliance. It was equivalent to severing an artery. The result? Higher production costs, rising retail prices, and shrinking competitiveness. Instead of protecting American auto workers, Tariffs risked making their jobs more vulnerable as manufacturers faced narrowing profit margins and intensified foreign competition. Several firms began warning the United States Department of Commerce that if the tariff confrontation continues, long-term investments might shift toward regions with fewer trade disruptions, including Mexico and Southeast Asia. Furthermore, Canada's consumer boycott revealed an overlooked hazard. The United States had underestimated how powerful Canadian purchasing behavior could be. American automakers treated the Canadian market as guaranteed an assumption that collapsed once political pressure escalated. The loss of market share north of the border not only reduced immediate revenue, but also weakened the economies of scale that United States automakers rely upon in global competition. As analysts from the Brookings Institution noted, the United States attempted to pressure Canada, but instead exposed structural weaknesses that had been hidden beneath decades of integration. And those weaknesses now form the center of an emerging strategic dilemma. Yet, the international landscape poses an even larger challenge for Washington. While the United States and Canada remained locked in an escalating confrontation, foreign governments and global corporations observed the situation with increasing concern. For decades, the United States had positioned itself as the anchor of North American economic stability. But the sudden volatility, unpredictable tariffs, and the breakdown of a 30-year auto cooperation framework forced many international partners to reconsider their assumptions. Japan accelerated its battery and electric vehicle component partnerships with Canada, locking in multi-year procurement deals. South Korean conglomerates expanded their Canadian operations, citing stable political conditions and reliable access to minerals such as nickel, lithium, and cobalt. The European Union classified Canada as a priority partner in several joint industrial frameworks, crediting its regulatory predictability and long-term investment incentives. At the same time, Southeast Asian nations, particularly those within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, strengthened their position as the world's most reliable mid-stage manufacturing region. With North American supply chains showing signs of fracture, several multinational firms began shifting components and assembly projects toward Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. This geographic redirection could, over time, diminish the United States' dominance in global automotive production. Even China, despite tensions with Ottawa, capitalized on the situation. Beijing extended offers for industrial collaboration, particularly in the electric vehicle battery sector, giving Canadian firms access to both scale and technological capability. Signals from these transactions were unmistakable. Global partners were willing to align with Canada, but increasingly hesitant to rely on a United States policy environment defined by unpredictability. These developments raise a difficult question for Washington. If trade disruptions continue, will the United States remain the central hub of North American automotive production, or will that role gradually shift to a more diversified network that excludes American dominance? And yet, the most consequential shift is still ahead. Because in the next phase of this conflict, a long-term strategic risk will emerge, one that could alter the balance of industrial power across the entire continent. As Canada rebuilt its economic footing during the trade confrontation, it did more than stabilize short-term disruptions. It began quietly constructing a long-term strategy aimed at reducing structural dependence on the United States, a strategy that could permanently redefine the balance of North American manufacturing power. For decades, Canada's industrial model relied on the assumption that the United States would remain a predictable partner, a stable superpower, and an anchor market. But the tariff escalation shattered that assumption. In response, Ottawa undertook a sweeping transformation across multiple sectors: energy, critical minerals, advanced manufacturing, electric vehicle supply chains, and defense production. Canada's critical mineral strategy gained extraordinary momentum. With vast reserves of nickel, lithium, cobalt, graphite, and potash, Canada emerged as a globally essential supplier for battery and semiconductor manufacturing. Japanese and South Korean firms invested heavily in extraction and refining. European Union companies signed multi-year procurement agreements to secure access to low-risk minerals. These partnerships created predictable, long-term industrial ecosystems that were not vulnerable to sudden unilateral decisions from Washington. Canada's domestic manufacturing strategy also accelerated. Billions were channeled into nuclear energy development, liquefied natural gas infrastructure, high-efficiency transportation corridors, and modernization of ports across both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. These investments reduced cost volatility, strengthened national self-sufficiency, and attracted global manufacturers seeking stability. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. Canadian policymakers, corporate leaders, and households collectively shifted their expectations about the future. No longer was the United States viewed as the automatic center of gravity for Canadian economic planning. Canada was now acting like a nation determined to chart its own industrial course, one that leaned on Asia, Europe, and emerging markets just as confidently as it once leaned on Washington. This shift was more than policy. It was identity. And it created a long-term trajectory that the United States could no longer assume it controlled. Yet, the implications for Washington were even more profound. From the perspective of the United States, the greatest danger of the current confrontation is not the immediate job losses, the rising production costs, or the shrinking Canadian market share. The deeper threat is what analysts now describe as a slow-motion transfer of industrial gravity. The United States auto sector has historically operated with three strategic pillars: predictable cross-border integration, stable access to foreign minerals, and dominant control over North American consumer markets. The tariff conflict is eroding all three pillars simultaneously. First, integration with Canada is weakening. Supply chain fluidity, long regarded as the heart of North American manufacturing efficiency, has been disrupted. If this fragmentation continues, American companies may accelerate offshoring to Mexico or Asia, bypassing the Canadian network entirely and reducing the United States' own influence over regional production. Second, access to minerals is no longer guaranteed. Canada's new long-term agreements with Asia and Europe mean that American firms may face higher costs, longer procurement times, and reduced bargaining power. This is especially dangerous for electric vehicle manufacturing, where mineral supply determines competitive viability. Third, consumer markets are shifting. Canada's boycott demonstrated that American brands are not immune to political backlash. If this trend spreads to other sectors, or if other countries adopt similar retaliatory behavior, the United States could face structural vulnerability in industries far beyond automobiles. These changes raise an unsettling question. Is the United States still the anchor of North American industrial power, or is its influence beginning to slip? What comes next may determine whether the United States can still lead the continent's manufacturing future, or whether that leadership is already starting to move elsewhere. The confrontation between the United States and Canada has evolved far beyond a dispute over tariffs or trade rules. It has become a full-scale redefinition of how industrial power is distributed across the continent. For the first time in modern North American history, Canada is no longer reacting to United States policy. It is shaping its own path, forging new alliances, and restructuring its economy around long-term stability rather than assumed dependence. Meanwhile, the United States is facing a reality that few policymakers anticipated. Supply chains, once considered untouchable, have shown their fragility. Markets once considered loyal have demonstrated their volatility. And a strategy originally promoted as a shield for American workers has revealed vulnerabilities that stretch far beyond the auto sector. The question now confronting Washington is no longer whether this trade conflict will have consequences, but how far those consequences will reach. Will the United States recalibrate its approach, or will this confrontation accelerate the shift of industrial influence toward a more diversified North American landscape? Is this a bold strategy, or a risky mistake that could reshape the future of the United States? Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis.